Story: Whose soul turned into a demon? Chapter 2. We heard the mingling of the wind and felt a shiver, unmistakably human sounds, yet resembling the whistling wind. Or was it just we's imagination? Shaking his head in disbelief at what he had just heard, Wee trembled, burrowing his head into the blanket and trying to shut his eyes, ignoring whatever was happening outside, or even if a human figure appeared under the blanket, he wouldn't move a muscle. Outside, the wind suddenly ceased, and as Wee wrapped himself tightly in the blanket, he saw nothing more happening and cautiously peeked outside. He gradually breathed a sigh of relief as the terrifying things seemed to have stopped appearing. But thinking of the mixed sound in the wind, was it Yen? Which Yen? Could it be Yen, Wee's first love? If Huan's ghost came back to remind Wee, why mention Yen? He felt that behind the bizarre events happening to him today, a series of even more terrifying events were about to unfold. Shaking his head, Wee decided to go to sleep immediately, and tomorrow he would spend the whole day investigating the situation in Thung village over the past years. And above all, he had to find out about Yen, the person he had been thinking about for years. Hoo-hoo. Outside, the wind had gradually subsided, and Wee sank deep into sleep. Early the next morning, when Wee woke up, Mrs. Tu Hoai had brought breakfast for him. In the morning conversation, Mrs. Tu Hoai even asked if Wee had dreamt of anything last night because Mr. Fook said he saw Huyen standing outside Wee's house calling him, but Wee ignored and didn't respond. Mrs. Tu Hoai intuitively thought that maybe Wee had really met Huyen last night. Because it was similar to the last time, when Mr. Fook dreamt of his daughter, it matched the time Wee met Huyen. But Wee's only vague response to Mrs. Tu Hoai was that indeed Huyen did not appear yesterday, and the mixed sound in the wind, he didn't know if it was true or not, so he couldn't use it as an answer for Mrs. Tu Hoai. Furthermore, Wee also didn't truly believe in ghosts, even if others did, he didn't. Ghosts were just something people fabricated to scare the gullible and profit from them, there was no truth to them. As for the incidents Wee encountered in the past few days, he adamantly insisted they were hallucinations. After this trip, Wee had to visit Green Pond Hospital to see an old friend working there, to ask him to check if Wee had some sort of mental illness. Continuing with Mrs. Tu Hoai's story, she recounts tales of ghosts and demons that she believes exist. In the past, my family members also encountered the spirits of the deceased many times during the war. I even remember one time when I met an old friend just 2 days after her death. She warned me that the Americans would drop bombs the next day. I didn't believe her, but the next day, I was transferred to another unit just in time before the bombing. Oh my, the entire unit of hundreds of people perished, except for me and the driver. Mrs. Tu Hoai continued. Since Huan's death, Mr. Fook in my house has been haunted. I heard that a rooster's crow can ward off spirits and ease the haunting of the living by the dead. I think it's because Huyen is angry with Mr. Fook for some reason. So I followed the advice and kept only a few roosters at home, selling all the hens to the neighbor. I hope that Huyen would spare Mr. Fook from such things. And indeed, Fook felt better, but yesterday he encountered Huyen again. It must be because I killed all the roosters for the death anniversary ceremony, so Huyen found his way back to haunt Mr. Fook. Wee shook his head and said, Mrs. Hoai, I must clarify again, I do not believe that ghosts and demons exist in this world. Science has not proven their existence either. Regarding this morning's incident, it was probably just a dream, and I imagined it. Surely it wasn't Huyen returning. Please, listen to me once, Huyen is gone, so let her rest in peace. Her death was already tragic enough. To me, Huyen has always been like a younger sister, and that will never change. Her loss deeply saddens me, but the living must continue living and not let the past haunt them forever. As Wee spoke, his eyes reddened, tears threatened to fall as he remembered Huyen's image from childhood. But before he could finish, the portrait of Huyen on the ancestral altar that Mrs. Tu Hoai brought over suddenly caught fire in the evening. The fire consumed the portrait from the clothes to the lips, to Huan's eyes, turning the image into a horrifying sight. Huan's lips seemed to curl in dissatisfaction, her eyes engulfed in flames, leaving only one eye before it extinguished, turning her entire gaze in the portrait into a terrifying black. Mrs. Tu Hoai, with her head bowed, listened to Wee's analysis, then suddenly screamed as she noticed the burning portrait, clasping her hands in prayer and murmuring repeatedly. She quickly lit incense at the altar bowl and prayed several times. At that moment, the burning flames gradually subsided and eventually extinguished completely. Having finished her prayers, Mrs. Tu Hoai picked up Huan's portrait, crying as she spoke. "Perhaps Huyen doesn't want to stay here with you, so I'll take her back home. I thought she returned to give you a dream because you were so close, but it seems not." Mrs. Tu Hoai said this with a hint of resentment, blaming Wee's earlier words for touching upon spiritual matters. She thought that was why Huyen was angry, so she decided not to leave her daughter's portrait at Wee's house anymore. Mrs. Tu Hoai walked out with the portrait, disappearing into the distance, out of Wee's view. Wee sighed heavily, sitting on the chair, feeling drained. His eyes felt heavy, and he slumped down unknowingly. He was too exhausted from the recent events of the past few days, and sleep quickly overcame him, right there on the chair. Clock ticking. The wind outside slammed against the door, which had been left open since the afternoon. Wee was alone in the desolate, eerie house, making the surroundings seem even more desolate. The sound of the door slamming too loudly made Wee slowly open his eyes, feeling tired as he glanced around, then down at his wristwatch, muttering, "Damn, did I oversleep till 9 in the evening?" Wee staggered to his feet, still not fully awake from his nap. He went downstairs to wash up, then hastily cooked himself a meal. By the time he finished eating, it was already 11 at night. Wee closed up the house, took the book with him to bed, intending to read and stay awake until morning. He would catch an early ride back to the city tomorrow. The events of the past 2 days had made him reluctant to stay any longer in the village of Thung. It was late at night, and the already unusually quiet sounds became even quieter. The chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, and the rustling of insects outside made it difficult for Wee to focus on reading. He flipped through the pages of the book lazily, unable to pay attention to its contents. His reading felt mechanical. As Wee was struggling to concentrate on the book, the wind outside suddenly picked up. The door swung wide open, and all the lights in the house flickered out. Startled, Wee hastily closed the book and reached for the flashlight on the bedside table, but it wouldn't turn on. He clumsily got up from bed, feeling his way to the altar table to find some candles to light up. At that moment, the door suddenly swung wide open. Creak. The eerie sound of the door sent shivers down Wee's spine. He quickly turned to look at the door. Outside, under the faint moonlight, a long-haired figure stood at the doorway. Wee could see someone standing outside, staring at him intently without moving, a familiar figure. He must have met that person somewhere before. It was the same figure, the same attire. Wee was shocked, almost in disbelief, stammering, "Huyen, it's you, isn't it?" The figure outside the door remained silent, just bowing its head slightly as its hair gently fluttered. From outside the window, a chilling voice came from the figure. "Wee, how could you betray me like this? I gave you all my love, yet you treated me like a sister, didn't you?" Wee knew that the ghost of Huyen was outside the door now. Despite being terrified, he tried to gather courage to speak. "Huyen, I think you've misunderstood. It's been 10 years since we last met. You were just a little girl back then. How could there be any feelings between us?" After Wee finished speaking, the ghost outside the door suddenly fell silent, then after a while, it spoke softly. "Perhaps you're right, but your time is running out. First, we shouldn't talk about that. You must listen to me. Tomorrow morning, you must leave here. If you delay even for a day, you'll end up like me, you'll be haunted by Sister Yen." As Huen's ghost said this, it suddenly turned its head as if wary of something behind, then its figure trembled in fear and disappeared. Wee hadn't finished asking questions, there were still many things he hadn't understood. He wanted to call Huon's ghost back, but all he got in response was silence. The lights in the house suddenly came back on, and Wee nodded off to sleep, realizing he had dozed off on the pages of his book again. He looked out of the house and muttered, "Huyen, you still haven't told me why I have to leave the village. I was planning to leave tomorrow morning, but I suspect this is related to your death. So I won't easily overlook it. I have to clarify your death, only then can you truly rest in peace. Huyen, forgive me for not being able to listen to you, forgive me." Wee tightened his determined grip, feeling exponentially courageous. Facing everything head-on rather than avoiding it, Wee didn't want to live like a guilty person, constantly anxious about unanswered questions. That wasn't his nature. Wee focused on reading through the pages to make time pass quickly, and by morning, he had changed into clean clothes. He swiftly sat on his motorbike and headed straight to Yen's former house to investigate everything. If what he thought was true, the Yen that Huyen mentioned, could she be Wee's first love? Thinking over and over again, what made that Yen want to haunt him, could only be something directly related to him, so that Yen was not anyone else, but the girl named Da Ti Hong Yen, Wee's first love, who shared the same dream with him but couldn't fulfill it together. Thinking back, on the day Wee stepped on the train to go abroad for studies, Yen didn't appear. Even though Yen loved him dearly that day, could it be that his lover going abroad for studies didn't bid him farewell? Could it be that on that day, everything started happening? Wee rode his bike straight across the fields. Yen's old house on the other side of the fields slowly came into view. Wee saw that it had changed a lot compared to before. In front of Yen's old house used to be a vine trellis of gourds, and next to the house was a chicken coop. But now, all those things had been removed, and the entire house had been renovated into a grocery store. Wee rode his bike to the front door, parked it neatly, and then confidently walked into the house. Inside, there was a middle-aged man in his 50s, smoking a pipe incessantly. After finishing a puff of tobacco, he exhaled the smoke, turned towards the door, and upon seeing Wee, he immediately asked, "Who are you looking for?" Wee glanced around the entire house, the man sitting in front of him, not Yen's father, nor the person Wee was looking for, but he could still ask. Wee said, "Are you the owner of this house?" The man nodded and said, "Yes, I'm Dat. I bought it 10 years ago." After Dat finished speaking, Wee widened his eyes and said, 10 years. That time frame coincided with when Wee went abroad for studies. Dat glanced at Wee's face, seeming to vaguely understand something, and said, "What do you want to ask? Just sit down on this chair, and I'll slowly tell you." After Dat finished speaking, he pointed to the chair next to him. Wee nodded and sat down as invited. After a while, he mustered the courage to ask, 10 years ago, when you bought this house, do you know why the previous owners sold it and moved away? Dat asked, "Are you a friend of the previous owner of this house?" Wee nodded. Dat continued, 10 years ago, when I bought this house, the previous owner faced a tragic event. Wee asked, "Sir, what tragic event was that?" Dat began to tell. That year, I returned from working abroad in Russia, saved up some money, and wanted to buy a house here for shelter and also for business purposes. I had my eye on this house, asked to buy it several times, but the owner refused to sell. However, later on, because the owner had encountered a tragic event, he urgently sold the house and moved away. We asked, "Sir, do you know why they moved away because of what tragic event?" Dat nodded, and his voice growled each word as if emphasizing. His daughter committed suicide, said to be, because of love-hatred. Because of love-hatred. Those 5 words hit Wee like a heavy hammer, making him dizzy. 10 years, it was the Yen of that day, the Yen that Huon's ghost mentioned, and ultimately died for a reason closely related to him, because of love-hatred. Those 5 words echoed in Wee's head continuously, which he couldn't dispel. Because of love-hatred. Wee kept repeating those 5 words, murmuring continuously, thinking back to that day's issue. Why did Yen have to commit suicide like that? Wee suddenly looked at Dat and continued to ask. Please tell me clearly about that. How did she die? Because of whose love-hatred did she commit suicide? Dat shook his head and said, I don't know. When I bought this house, the owner only shared that much. But Dat paused for a moment then continued. It seems that incident has been clearly documented at the Din Commune police station. On that day, after the owner moved away, the Din Commune police came here several times to ask about the incident to supplement the file, but the owner had already moved, so later they gradually stopped coming and didn't ask anything anymore. Upon hearing this, we immediately nodded, thanked Dat, then rode straight to the Din Commune headquarters, which was less than half a kilometer from the upper village. Through Dat's account, it seemed that this was the only clue for Wee to understand what happened that year, what ultimately led to Yen's death. Wee stopped the bike in front of the gate of the headquarters, walked into the headquarters courtyard, and met a security guard who appeared to be over 30 years old stepping out and asking, Who are you looking for? Wee found this security guard very familiar, as if they had met somewhere before, but he couldn't remember. But not only did Wee feel that way, but even the security guard also seemed to feel familiar with Wee. After pondering for a while, he suddenly exclaimed, Oh, are you Wee, Hoai's son from the upper village? Wee paused. You are. The security guard enthusiastically patted Wee's shoulder and said loudly, I'm Tan. Tan from the lower village, the guy who used to dunk your head in the water to teach you swimming. Wee joyfully exclaimed, Tan, it's been so long, I didn't recognize you. After saying that, the two brothers warmly talked. Tan, being 3 years older than Wee, used to be the leader of their group of friends. Later, after growing up, Tan went somewhere Wee didn't know, and even when Wee went abroad for studies, they didn't meet again. Unexpectedly, after 10 years, when Wee returned, Tan also came back to the village. Moreover, he became a security guard at the Din Commune government headquarters. By the way, why did you come to the commune headquarters? Tan suddenly asked. Wee completely wiped the smile off his face, his tone suddenly turned serious. I want to meet the commune police chief. I want to understand about the incident 10 years ago, starting from the day I went abroad. What happened to Yen? Wee said, and Tan seemed to understand. Nodding he said, I've heard about that incident when you came back, poor girl, and it's all because of you. Tan said until here, then sighed, not wanting to continue. Then he pointed to the end of the building and said, The commune police chief now is Uncle Kong, he's in that room. Wee nodded and said, Yes, thank you. Tan turned his head back and said, But let me lead you in case he doesn't recognize you. After all, you've been away for so long. And not everyone can access the case files. Let me explain to him nicely to help you. Saying that, Tan walked ahead to lead the way, and Wee followed without saying a word. Entering the room at the end of the headquarters, on the door was a sign that read, Head of the Commune Police Department. Tan paused for a moment, knocked on the door, and said loudly, Uncle Kong, it's me, Tan. Immediately, a voice came from inside. What's the matter, Tan? Just come in. After Uncle Kong spoke, Tan looked at Wee, nodded to signal him to follow. Tan walked in with Wee and asked, Uncle Kong, do you still have the case file from 10 years ago in the upper village? Uncle Kong, who was reading some documents, suddenly looked up and said, Case files can only be cancelled after 20 years, but what's the matter? At this point, without letting Tan speak, Wee stepped forward and said, Uncle, I want to review that case from back then. Specifically, I want to thoroughly review that case file. Uncle Kong had seen Wee from the beginning. He glanced at him then shook his head coldly and said, No, you don't have any authority to demand to see the file, just leave and let me work. Standing next to him, Tan suddenly explained, Uncle Kong, that case is related to him. Don't you remember him? He's Wee, Hoai's son from the upper village. Tan said here. Mr. Kong's eyes seemed to spark electric rays. He looked at Wee from head to toe, indeed very similar to Mr. Hoai. Mr. Hoai was a comrade in arms with Mr. Kong in the past. After liberation, Mr. Hoai returned to the countryside to work in farming, while Mr. Kong remained in the unit until 10 years ago when he was transferred to the Din Commune headquarters to assume the position of Chief of the Commune Police. At that time, it was also the time when the case occurred. So, whoever understands that case from that year the most, it can only be Mr. Kong. Mr. Kong nodded, asking about Wee's family situation. So you're Wee, Hoai's son, right? How are your parents doing lately? Are they still well? It's been so long since I last saw your father that I almost forgot his face. Mr. Kong chuckled. Wee also replied softly, yes, both my parents are well, sir. Mr. Kong didn't ask anything more, just turned around and stood up, pointing to the file cabinet behind, pulling out a set of files that looked very old. He placed it on the table, dusted it off, and then flipped through the files to verify whether it was the correct one he was looking for. After a while, he nodded to confirm and determined that it was indeed that set of files. He looked at Wee and said, here it is. He pushed the file set towards Wee. Wee trembled as he sat down, his hands placed on the files, overwhelmed with emotions surging up. The answer, at this moment, would be revealed, all doubts, all would be resolved. A curtain, slowly being lifted after being buried in dust for 10 years. The file set was labeled with clear words, case file, victim de T. Hong Yen. Each line in the file set gradually appeared before Wee's eyes. Date, March 1, 1989. Victim de T. Hong Yen, body found at the ancient well site of the upper village. The body was swollen from being submerged in water for a long time. The victim wore a black traditional outfit. Preliminary study showed that the victim died from suffocation, with a long hair bundle caught in the throat, no signs of resistance. Through forensic examination, it is possible that the victim committed suicide, but there is no precise evidence. Date, March 3, 1989. Investigating the cause of suicide, victim de T. Hong Yen on June 10, 1988, passed by the Lak Ha Pagoda and was attacked by a group of young men who had malicious intentions, forcibly restraining and dragging the victim behind the Lak Ha Pagoda to rape her. While being assaulted, the victim saw her lover, Trin Hoang Wee, passing by the scene. She cried for help but Wee didn't hear, leading to the criminal's actions culminating in tragedy. The testimony was provided by Mrs. Hoang T. Lai, as the victim only confided in her. De T. Hong Yen kept this incident secret out of shame. After about 6 months, she saw Trin Hoang Wee leaving for studying abroad. She believed Wee abandoned her after discovering the incident, which led to her losing the will to live and having foolish thoughts. On the evening of February 29, 1989, at 10 p.m., Mrs. Hoang T. Lai couldn't find her daughter, so she asked people to search. Mrs. Hoang T. Lai's family searched all night and found the victim's body floating in the ancient well of the upper village early the next morning. The incident was reported to the Din Commune Police at 10 a.m. on the same day. Based on the details of the victim's disappearance at 10 o'clock and forensic examination showing the victim likely died around 9 p.m. on February 29, 1989, just 2 days after Trin Hoang Wee went abroad. Preliminary conclusion: the victim committed suicide due to the circumstances related to the previous criminal group. The case is still under investigation to verify the perpetrators of the rape on June 10, 1988. Wee finished reading the entire file, tears streaming uncontrollably. He should have noticed something unusual about his lover that day, but Wee finished reading the entire content, feeling his responsibility was immense. And thinking about Huan's ghost telling him that Yen wanted to harm him, made him rethink that he had been terribly wrong and wanted to make amends for Yen. It was because of him. Why didn't he pay attention? His lover was being assaulted by thugs right near him without him knowing, leading to her tragic death. Wee felt sorry, blaming himself even more. He had to make up for Yen, at any cost. Wee placed the file set on the table, then looked at Mr. Kong to request. There's another case I want to see. The victim's name is Fan Hong Huyen, also in the upper village. Mr. Kong also agreed, searching for a while, then found a thin blue file set. We quickly took it, reading through the file about Huan's death, but it was indeed similar to what Mrs. Tu Hoai recounted. Huan's death was unclear, and the file didn't provide much more information. We returned both sets of files to Mr. Kong, then silently rode his motorcycle back to the upper village. Throughout the journey, he kept thinking about Yen's death, feeling constantly tormented. Finally, he decided he had to go to the place where Yen sacrificed herself to look once, and also wanted to say the words of denial to her. He stopped by a grocery store on the riverbank to buy fruits, cakes, candles, then headed straight to the ancient well of the upper village. The ancient well of the upper village gradually appeared before him. The village well now looked lifeless compared to the past. In the past, the village well was bustling with people, washing, bathing, and vibrant activities. But now, looking at the village well, it was muddy, the well water as dark as sewage. Moss covered the water surface. Even the villagers didn't come near because the smell of the well water was unpleasant. We placed the fruit candy down by the edge of the well, right where he and Yen used to talk in the old days. Then he lit incense and candles to burn, placing the incense in a small sand dune nearby. We didn't know how to pray, but he still clasped his hands together like Mrs. Tu Hoai, bowed his head 3 times, and muttered under his breath, "Yen, my mistakes from that day can never be forgiven. If I could, I would die with you, but my parents are too old now, and the living still need to go on. If I were to follow you, there would be no one to care for my parents. So, I light this incense here, hoping that when our spirits reunite, I will return here with you to choose our love." Tears streamed down Wee's face as he finished his prayer, and he suddenly stepped closer to the well, dipping his hand into the water and splashing it onto his face, as if trying to provoke Yen's anger. He was about to throw himself into the well to cleanse himself, to alleviate the feeling of guilt, when suddenly a voice rang out loudly behind him. "Oh heavens, Wee, are you crazy? Why are you diving into that well?" Wee abruptly stopped his actions, turning his head to see Mrs. Tu Hoai running towards him, shouting. In a matter of moments, she reached him and exerted all her strength to pull him away from the edge of the well, explaining, "Do you know why our village well has become like this? It's because so many people have died here, including Huyen." Mrs. Tu Hoai went on to explain that 10 years ago, after Yen's death, the village well of Thung began to be a peculiar place. Many people died there as if they were drawn to their deaths by ghosts. People washing clothes slipped and fell into the well, people bathing were pulled in by rats, and so on. Moreover, as time went on, the number of deaths at this well for unclear reasons increased, and Huyen, Mrs. Tu Hoai's daughter, was one of the victims. After Mrs. Tu Hoai finished recounting these events, she went straight home, leaving Wee to contemplate alone. Wee's house was near the well, so when Mrs. Tu Hoai saw Wee about to jump into the well, she rushed out to stop him. Now, having explained everything, she didn't want to stay near the well for another minute because the eerie atmosphere and foul odor were unbearable, and they reminded her of painful memories of Huyen, so she didn't want to be near it anymore. After Mrs. Tu Hoai finished explaining, Wee remained despondent for half a day before finally standing up and returning home. After bathing, Wee went to visit relatives until the end of the day. Only in the evening did he return home, deciding that now that everything was clear, there was no reason to stay in the village any longer. So, tomorrow morning, for whatever reason, he would leave. That night, in the old house of Mr. Hoai and Mrs. Ik, Wee carefully packed his belongings and prepared diligently so that the next morning he only needed to pick up his backpack and return to the city. As he arranged his belongings, the wind outside suddenly blew fiercely, seeming stronger than ever before, and he could sense some anger in it. Bang! The door of the house suddenly swung open, revealing the figure of a long-haired girl in white clothes, her face pale. That figure was the ghost of Huyen, and amidst the wind, Huyen's voice sounded mournful as she said, "Wee, why don't you listen to me? Why don't you leave as I told you? Wee was stunned. At this point, he was no longer afraid of Huan's ghost. He calmly replied, "I want to understand your death, Yen's death, so I can't leave immediately. But now it's okay, I understand everything, and tomorrow morning I will leave." After Wee finished speaking, Huan's ghost shook her head, her voice sorrowful. "It's too late, there's no time. Since you plunged into the village well, even if you go anywhere, Yen can still follow you." Wee bravely said, "If Yen follows me, fine, I'll make it up to her. Even if she wants my life, I'll give it to her. But I don't think Yen would harm me. She loved me." Huan's ghost exclaimed, "You don't understand. Yen is no longer the Yen she used to be. She's a vengeful spirit now, devoid of reason, consumed by hatred." Wee replied, "Then let her kill me." Huyen cried out louder, her voice ominous. "If you die, she won't stop. She'll kill all your loved ones, everyone connected to you. They will all die. Only if you live can she be stopped." Huyen fell silent for a moment before continuing. "Even I have been imprisoned by her. Those who died in the village well, all her misguided souls. If you die, no one can stop her anymore. As long as you're alive, she can't harm anyone, and she might even help us gain freedom from this cycle of rebirth." Explaining up to this point, Wee understood everything. He felt not following Huan's words was truly a terrifying mistake, but now regret was too late. Wee could only seek Huan's help, his voice trembling. "So what should I do?" Huan's ghost sighed and said, "Just get through tonight. If you can survive, then she won't be able to harm you anymore. Because by tomorrow, the effect of the well water will have worn off. Then, all you have to do is leave the village." Wee said, "But how can I stop her?" Huan's ghost spoke firmly. "I will help you. Just persevere. No matter how much she tempts you, she can't make you leave this house. Because this house is protected by our ancestors' spirits. So for tonight, she can't do anything, but if it continues, it's uncertain. As long as I and your ancestors' spirits protect this house, you can survive tonight. But you must remember, no matter what she says, you must not leave this house. You must remember, she is no longer Yen, but a demon." After Huan's ghost finished speaking, it suddenly disappeared, the door slammed shut, and all the nooks and crannies in the house, windows, and shutters all automatically closed. Wee opened his eyes wide, watching everything happening around him, sweat pouring down, his hands clenched in determination, determined to survive this night. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The ticking of the clock echoed slowly in the silent space. Wee closed his eyes tightly, waiting, not daring to lie down on the bed, afraid that once he lay down under the bed, he wouldn't be able to keep his mind firm, and then Yen's ghost would lure him out of the house without him knowing. Wee thought that if he died, it wouldn't matter much, but if his death implicated too many people, then he would be a despicable criminal. His parents, Huan's parents, the people in this village, if his death led to their sacrifice, he wouldn't even have a face to meet his deceased ancestors. Moreover, they didn't deserve to pay for his sins, so tonight he must survive. As long as he's alive, there's still hope. Furthermore, he also wants to find a way to rescue Huyen because according to Huan's words, she was being forced by Yen, suffering greatly. Her death was inexplicable, and he couldn't let Huyen, whom he regarded as his own sister, suffer like that. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The clear sound of the clock bell rang out, indicating that it was midnight. This is the time when demons begin to roam most fiercely according to Buddhist scriptures and Christian scriptures. The sound of the wind howled outside, gradually getting stronger, making Wee feel that the impending danger was approaching very close. Rustle, rustle. The wooden door outside the house creaked open gently, the wind suddenly stopped abruptly, and only faint rustling sounds could be heard outside the window. Wee suddenly smelled a familiar scent, a scent that had been in his memory for a long time. "It's Yen," he whispered softly. He waited for a while, but nothing happened as he expected. Right at this moment, another familiar voice sounded a warning. "Wee, you must remember what I told you. Wee was startled by the sudden voice. Wee, it's me. Yen. The voice lingered softly. It was her, the voice that Yen whispered into his ear back then, a voice like sweet honey that intoxicated Wee. Wee immediately jolted. Yen, is it really you? Unable to contain himself, he asked back. Even though he had been reminded by Huan's ghost, he couldn't control himself from responding to Yen. Wee, come closer to me. Yen's voice in the wind lingered. Wee couldn't see Yen, he could only feel the voice coming from the gap in the window behind him. He hesitantly stepped closer, his hands trembling, eager to open the window. But at that moment, another voice suddenly warned him. Wee, remember what I said. As Huan's voice echoed, Wee reached out halfway, then quickly withdrew his hand. Immediately, he could hear Yen's furious cries reverberating. Amidst her furious screams, Yen said, You wretch, how dare you, return Wee to me. The house door kept banging fiercely, the wood seemed to want to break, and Wee, terrified, sat crouched in a corner of the house. After a while of futile threats from Yen's ghost, her voice softened and echoed into the house. Wee, listen to me, come out here with me. Surely you regret your mistakes. I don't need you to compensate me for anything, just let me see your face once. Yen's voice pleaded. But Wee had made up his mind, he didn't even respond. Several times like this, Yen switched to threatening him. If you don't come out now, I will kill Huyen, then I will kill your whole family. Yen's ghost threatened, but Wee remained silent. Yen continued her old tricks, softly reminiscing about their memories. Do you remember when you told me about the western lands you visited? You've been there, why don't you tell me about it? Wee, I can't go abroad like you, so you have to let me know what that country is like. Wee, answer me. I just want to see you once. Wee, please. Yen's voice choked with tears and cried out in utmost pity. Wee felt a pang of heartache. Memories flooded back, making it impossible for him to control himself. It was that voice, that person. At this moment, he wanted to embrace Yen at any cost, to satisfy his longing. He wanted her scent to envelop him, wanted to feel those soft, tender lips. No, but a shred of reason stopped him, keeping Wee's footsteps in place. Yen had no other choice, she continued to threaten, then softened again. Throughout the long, chilling night, Wee was tormented by memories, and his soul was tortured. Many times he wanted to open the door and ignore everything, but in the end, he managed to hold on in the final moments. The whole night had passed, dawn was breaking, and Yen felt she had lost her chance. The terrifying voice of Yen gradually disappeared, and Wee successfully survived this ordeal. After this night, Wee's tears flowed too much, his emotions too overwhelming. He just wanted to collapse unconscious from exhaustion. But he was still aware of what needed to be done. At 8 in the morning, he got on a bus back to the city. He had decided, from now on, he would never set foot in this village again. Regarding Huan's situation, before leaving, she had explained to him that as long as he left the village, after some time, Yen would have no reason to exist. Then she and those trapped in the village well would also be freed. Everything would truly come to an end when Wee never appeared on this land again. Wee returned to the city, heaved a sigh of relief because finally everything had ended. That countryside, those memories, would finally be stored in his heart, and never brought up again in the future. Mr. Hoai and Mrs. Ik saw their son return and just wanted to take care of him as much as possible, without bothering to ask what he had been doing for the past few days. Even though Mr. Hoai had received a letter from England reporting that Wee had returned home for several days, he guessed that Wee was busy with work, and didn't ask. He didn't even know that before coming home, Wee had passed by the place where he and Mrs. Ik had to flee a few years ago. If he knew Wee intended to go there, he would definitely try to stop him. At dinner, Mrs. Ik urged her son to go shower, then waited for him to come down to eat. Wee slept through the whole day, and by dinner, he went upstairs to greet the family and followed his mother's instructions to go wash up before dinner. He poured hot water into the long bathtub, added some soap, and immersed himself in the water to clean thoroughly. He wanted to wash away all the thoughts in his mind and relax completely. After bathing, as we stood up to dry himself, Mrs. Ick downstairs called out loudly to urge him. "We, come down to eat." We replied loudly, "Yes, Mom, I'm coming down." He hastily turned off the light switch and closed the bathroom door, running downstairs. Everything seemed to have truly come to an end, but click! The light switch that we had just turned off suddenly flicked back on automatically. The light bulb lit up. Once again. Click! The light bulb flicked off again. The light switch kept flicking on and off, causing the light to constantly flicker. In the bathtub just now, before we had a chance to drain it, suddenly there was a girl's figure singing softly, the girl's body wearing a peasant outfit, her long hair reaching the ground, and it kept extending. We wasn't here at the moment, otherwise, he would immediately recognize that the figure belonged to Yen. But there was another terrifying thing. Yen's face turned back, but one half was not her face, but Huan's. His little sister, the ghost that we had trusted from the beginning to the end of the story. At this moment, no one knew that the ghosts had not truly forgiven we. It had followed we from the house in the countryside, all the way to this urban area. And the game was now officially starting. The following days would be a horrifying nightmare for we and his family. Yen was no longer a simple spirit, she had turned into a demon for killing too many people. Downstairs, Mr. Hoai had just taken a sip of water, then choked as if someone's hand was reaching into his throat. He coughed continuously as if something was stuck in his throat. A bundle of black hair slowly flowed out from his mouth, marking an impending action of the demon when determining its first victim in this house. As we came downstairs, he opened a photo album documenting the death of Yen. Suddenly, he noticed the beginning of the file, and remembered the incident when he drank with his 4 close friends, which was the bundle of hair in his throat. The beginning of the file also mentioned, when Yen's body was discovered, there was also a hair bundle stuck in her throat. Could it be? We shook his head and chuckled to himself. After all, everything was over. Huan's ghost had said, everything would end when he left that village. But as we stepped into the living room, he immediately saw a horrifying sight. Mr. Hoai was desperately using his hands to pull at his throat, and from his throat, long strands of hair were gushing out, identical to the bundle of hair we had pulled out from his own throat before. And he remembered, it was after that incident that the horrifying events in the village of Fang began to happen to him. Wee's eyes widened in terror, his eyes bloodshot, he shouted. Yen, when will you ever forgive me? The end.
Hopefully the content has brought you interesting and meaningful moments. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel to follow the channel's next videos. See you in the next video. Have a good day.